We are going to start the third session, the third talk. Ivan, can you just close the door, please? Okay. So I'm going to introduce the next speaker. Professor Ayona came from the UK, and the next speaker comes from Toronto, Canada. So Conor Spelliscy is the co-founder and executive director of the Decentralization Research Centre, a non-profit organization with a mission to support non-partisan decentralization research and act as a hub for critical stakeholders in order to encourage equitable ownership, governance, and regulation of emerging technologies like AI and blockchain. So Conor previously co-founded the Blockchain Association and the Canadian Web3 Council, the leading industry associations for blockchain companies in the United States and Canada, respectively. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Igor, Dr. Calzada, and thank you, Ayuna Anaxion. Hope that pronunciation was okay, for hosting this event. It's fabulous. Beautiful space, too. For everyone online, if you haven't been to San Sebastian before, you should definitely come. There's a lot to be seen. I was sitting by the window there, and there's just like so much to look at. So I kind of feel sorry for you people online, actually. So I come at this from a much different background than Dr. Calzada or Dr. Dada. And I'm not an academic. I'm a lawyer formally, and I actually got in first the blockchain industry in 2017 when I was helping organizations kind of form and think about the new technology, because I was a tech lawyer working in Canada, but also with American companies. And so with that lens, I started an organization called the Blockchain Association, which is the biggest industry association in the United States. So I've become much more familiar with lobbying and advocacy in the US and how that works, and the connection between research institutions and policymakers, and thinking about the ways in which policymakers understand information about things like technology, what the channels of communication are that are necessary to hit in order to get your message across to people who might champion certain policy positions that you think are important, like decentralization, like AI for social impact, etc. So we were actually originally called the DAO Research Collective, and it was under that guise that I first met Igor. We were hosting an event at Stanford. And so DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, are a form of blockchain organization or community. And there are a lot of interesting things about DAOs and how they work. But there are also a lot of things that are quite similar to how organizations like cooperative works. In many ways, DAOs are almost cooperatives that have been enabled by blockchain technology to assume sort of new features and characteristics that were probably not available to most cooperatives. And of course, most cooperatives are not very digital in the first place. So DAOs are about 500 years ahead in some respects, but in other ways, there are some practicalities that need to be worked out to get there. While we were focused on DAOs and we were hosting events at Harvard and at Stanford and other institutions in the United States, we realized that one of the things most interesting to us was actually decentralization as a concept, and not just DAOs, not just decentralized autonomous organizations. And we were really interested in things like decentralized social media, which, in a very practical way could just be Mastodon servers organized as cooperatives federating, right? A very simple example of that. We're seeing more and more of that kind of thing happen in the world of emerging technologies, right? Using blockchain technologies, thinking about AI a little bit more and the impact it's going to have. And so we expanded to become the Decentralization Research Centre. So last year we hosted events at Stanford again, and at the Harvard Kennedy School, University of Tokyo, the University of Toronto, and just recently at the National Press Club in DC, where we're bringing members of Congress, we're bringing policymakers, regulators, academics, industry to talk about decentralization as almost an underlying ethos to how to build technology. So the builders in those rooms aren't all coming from AI, they're coming from AI, and they're coming from digital identity worlds, they're coming from blockchain-based sort of builders in industry, but they share a lot of the same problems, which is how to communicate what it is that you do to policymakers and kind of break through the noise, because it's quite a difficult task to get in front of policymakers with this kind of information, right? Because they're thinking about firefighter pensions, and they're thinking about space exploration and the Navy, and then to say, also, we'd love for you to think about AI, and here's how AI works, is generally a bridge too far, unless they just have a particular interest. So how do you get in front of them and communicate that message? And so that brings us a bit to sort of the framing that I have when I look at an issue like this. And when I'm going to talk about AI today, I'm going to talk about AI, but I'm also going to talk about the kind of second order effects. And one we've seen a lot of at the Decentralization Research Centre. Dr. Calzada mentioned a paper that I co-authored with folks at OpenAI and at Harvard and a variety of other institutions with leading programs on digital identity. And a lot of that has to do with WorldCoin. So we'll get into a little bit of that. But first of all, thanks again for having us. This has been a fabulous event. So I'm going to frame the talk in terms of the Global South. And I'm by no means as much an expert as that as Dr. Data, but I do have a little bit of a realm from personal experience, but then also seeing the way in which the Global South is dealt with when it comes to big tech, particularly in the United States. The talk is going to start a little bit scary, but ultimately I'm going to identify a few bright spots where I think that we can move on from the current status quo of big tech dominance of so many of these industries. There we go. So I want to start by giving a worst case scenario that may come to light as a result of quick changing emerging technologies. So imagine this, right? A dystopian future. Almost all jobs have been taken by AI. To ensure survival, you have a protocol that has provided you with a digital wallet, tied your eye scan, and it's sending you cryptocurrency. And it can send you cryptocurrency because it's identified that you're a human, so you can receive it. And it needs to identify that you're a human because bots have become so good at imitating humans online that it's very difficult for non-biometric means of determining whether someone is, in fact, human or a bot. And there are going to be a lot of identity theft implications tied to all of this. This company uses an object called the orb to scan your eyes and then issue you a blockchain wallet through which you're able to sign things cryptographically to indicate that you are, in fact, a human, and through which you receive payment to continue living because you don't have a job because AI has taken your job. And so this kind of sounds a lot like science fiction, but it could be a plausible future. And WorldCoin is a company, as Professor Calzada mentioned, that has been co-founded by Sam Altman. So Sam Altman has co-founded OpenAI, and then he's also co-founded WorldCoin. So it's very easy in many ways to dismiss this company as something that's absolutely ridiculous and stupid and will never really come to anything. But Sam Altman is a man who is very well positioned to see what the future of AI looks like, right? And this seems a little fantastical in some ways, but they've already scanned the eyes of millions of people, most of them in the Global South, and issued some of them cryptocurrency for having accepted those scans. And, taking a step back here, even if organizations like OpenAI were to stop what they're doing or to stop using WorldCoin, we're likely headed towards a path where, given the number of organizations building generative AI technologies and sort of pace of advancement in this field, that we will inevitably get to a place where we will need something to identify that we are human online. It will not just be as easy as having a Facebook profile with your picture and a little bit of information about you. That'll be an incredibly easy thing to replicate. It already is. And so biometric systems are being introduced more and more frequently, in this case by WorldCoin, but also by governments and other players. We really set ourselves on a path with AI that likely can't be averted from a future that maybe doesn't look exactly like this, but looks a little bit like this. And so, WorldCoin's rollout of the strategy has not been without its problems, as you can imagine. They've been reprimanded globally for different operators attempting fake scans, for various people trying to steal tokens from those they were scanning, or even more rarely, scanning unwilling participants. And as a result, a number of different countries have banned WorldCoin, including Kenya, actually has banned WorldCoin. And you can think of the incentive mechanisms here that can lead to problems, right? So if you scan someone's eye and you get control of their biometric data and their biometric wallet, you could have ongoing streams of revenue imitating them as a unique human. The WorldCoin and OpenAI saga really highlights for us two key problems in the development of AI, which are specifically the proliferation of AI is going to take away jobs from a material amount of the population. And secondly, sophisticated AI will make it very difficult to distinguish between who is human and who is a bot online. And I'll cover both of those issues in this paper today. One, obviously, really closely tied to issues of the AI that we're even dealing with today as it relates to job loss. The second being really a second order effect of sophisticated AI. So this is the paper I mentioned that we published with OpenAI and a number of others on this very topic. And we certainly aren't advocating for WorldCoin in this paper. I'm certainly not, but I think it is relevant to identify that WorldCoin is solving for a problem that is real. I'm not going to opine on, we've written papers about whether what they're doing is good or is problematic, but I can at least say that it's certainly a very real problem. And so when we think about big tech ecosystem, like we all know this right now, technological and financial power is really ending up in the hands of very few people and very few organizations. This is especially true in AI, where large language models are both incredibly expensive to create and to maintain. And they are most frequently maintained now by big tech companies, which hold the biggest share or are just straight up running their own AI systems, which are the industry leaders. This phenomenon is called centralization, of course. The tendency of power and influence to be represented by fewer and fewer people. It's not unique to technologies. Democracies changing into autocracies or corporate monopolization are also very obvious examples of centralization. But the recent expansion of centrally controlled AI models, which can really reach into every corner of someone's digital life, of course, like their identity, it affects not only one country or one industry, but really everyone everywhere, right? Whereas monopolies, depending on what they were, maybe weren't so broadly impactful in the past. So at the Decentralization Research Centre, we believe that this type of centralization is both unnecessary and obviously very harmful. I don't think I need to convince this audience of that. I think it particularly harms the Global South as well. But I'd also like to be a little bit hopeful in this presentation and end with some bright spots about the ways in which I think that this transformation in technology could actually be useful for at least parts of the Global South. And I think we're most likely headed on a course for more problems for those in the Global South. Unfortunately, people without power are going to have more solutions thrust upon them and much more sophisticated solutions. But I'm optimistic that we, at least hopefully those in the room and those online, can start thinking about these problems today so we can start making changes as soon as possible. So I'm going to start by explaining how centralization has really become one of the hallmark problems of our digital lives and why we founded the Decentralization Research Centre to look at different ways of creating a new digital future. So when the internet was first created, it was widely hoped that it would allow people and institutions to interact in a way that distributed non-commercial information to people globally. This version of the web was really very much aspirational and was also really not that entertaining, right? It really didn't look as pretty or as sort of specifically tailored as the web today. Now, the introduction of search engines, the things like corporately owned and developed chat servers, the internet started to coalesce around those big tech companies that could create really very smooth technology. So you might think here like Yahoo Search or AOL Messenger. Now you fast forward to now and you have massive corporations that mediate almost every aspect of your experience through the internet. You have, of course, Amazon that gives you access to online shopping. You have Alphabet that gives you access to information through Google search. You have access to entertainment in the form of YouTube, and to sort of office products in the form of Google Docs. Meta gives you access to your friends and acquaintances via Instagram, via WhatsApp, via Facebook. Apple controls everything on your phone. And they all, also provide new services like cloud computing. They provide sign-in services. They provide access to every song ever recorded, every TV show ever recorded. They produce their own content now. So they proliferated really massively from the days of search or initial messenger. And so we call the fact that these kinds of organizations mediate every aspect of our lives centralization. And it's frequently a system whereby massive corporations leverage monopoly positions to determine what you see, what you get, and how they accrue profits. And we're seeing more pushback in the United States right now. Lena Khan is the head of the Federal Trade Commission, and she's gone after a number of big tech companies, and she recently had a very successful case against Google. This has been an ongoing battle in the United States where they've had a long history of fighting monopolies, including very famously organizations like AT&T, a big cell phone and internet service provider, which was also a big tech company in early days, which they separated into many parts, and it reformed again to be a behemoth once again. So even through antitrust, it's very difficult to really avert centralization. And so moving to AI now, whereas these companies simply used to mediate the content that you get, they are now producing the content that you get, right? They are creating the algorithms that are putting the tokens one after another so that you receive answers to questions that you're posing to them. They are the ones that are creating the video image generators that produce the content that you're seeing. So they're not just giving you access to Friends or to Seinfeld or to particular videos about what's happening in the Global South. They are now creating that content. And many people say, so what? Thanks Google, thanks Amazon. I'm so happy to have access to all this great free stuff. And for most people, I'm sure you find most of your friends, the status quo is totally fine. They're fine to have friends on Facebook. They're fine to have really a very high quality search engine in Google. The downsides, of course, are the massive risks and the costs of this model, particularly to those in countries that don't have really control over these tech companies. In regards to the topic we're going to discuss today, we're going to talk more specifically about these tech companies, decentralization, and the Global South, where people are generally much more vulnerable to the downsides of these kinds of services. A widely reported story in 2023 detailed the $2 an hour jobs that Kenyan data workers had labeling various information on OpenAI data sets. So information tied to child sexual abuse, bestiality, murder, suicide, torture, self-harm, incest, essentially the worst possible stuff, which OpenAI needed individuals to tag so that they weren't inserted into data models. The report also noted workers in Uganda and in India. These practices are really commonplace when compiling AI data sets, but also we've heard a lot about it with respect to social media companies, right? Social media companies requiring different individuals to at times mediate as individuals the content on their platform so they're not offside regulation in various places. And if you're a worker in the United States, you have potentially a recourse, which is maybe to sue Facebook, and a collective of workers have done that in the United States. If you're a worker in the Global South, if you're in Kenya or you're in India, you're going to have a very difficult time doing that. And particularly in countries that these big tech companies don't care that much about, they are willing to even pull out. And we're seeing, a bit of an episode with Twitter in Brazil right now, right? Very, very much recent, where Elon Musk has said, we're not going to abide by your requirements. And so they've shut down essentially Twitter for Brazilians, and there's a huge penalty if you use a VPN to access Twitter. So there are a lot of complications there too in terms of freedom of speech, et cetera, et cetera. We won't go into, but it's all a really big, messy, tangled web. And AI is making it a little bit more complicated. So I think these examples paint a pretty vivid picture, rather, of the harm that these big tech companies can perpetrate. But there are other less really vivid impacts that we don't see in our day-to-day, but we'll likely see as problems down the line as we see a number of different invasions into our kind of digital rights as a result of the continuing accrual of power to these organizations. An obvious one is a lack of privacy. That means companies are tracking every move you make, every purchase you make online. They're selling that information to advertisers, to pretty much anyone who will have it. They're certainly providing that information to governments. The inability to control your online identity and relations, right? If you leave Facebook, you can't take your friends. If you leave Instagram, you can't take your followers. They live there. If you're booted or blocked in those networks, well, tough luck. The coalescing of values around, of course, English language Silicon Valley, that for most people in the world is not really relevant to the way that they live their lives. There's not a lot of opportunity for localism. Silicon Valley, we've spent a lot of time there. It's a very unique, interesting, weird place full of a very particular kind of person, which is very much not representative of the rest of the people in the world. Exclusion of marginalized voices and the homogenization of offerings of digital services. So this is a pretty obvious one considering who's kind of creating these technologies in Silicon Valley. Really a monopolization effect of big tech, which has been a long part of US history and history globally. And finally, the centralization of profits for companies that are building technologies like AI that have the potential to put millions of people out of work, but then, of course, accrue corresponding profits to the companies that run with those products. So we're going to dive a little bit more specifically into some of the harms of centralization. And this is really thinking about the second order effect of the impact of AI. So appreciating that now we have bots that are sophisticated enough online to mimic humans, and not only generic humans, but individual humans. We're going to see more and more governments, in addition to WorldCoin, we're already seeing more and more governments respond by creating different forms of biometric data systems. And there was a really good study done by two professors at Cornell. And what they did was they had ChatGPT send 15,000 emails to the offices of policymakers. And this is a really common way in the US to communicate with your representative. You send them an email saying, I don't like abortion rights, or I like abortion rights, or I have a problem with my local grocer, or whatever, right? And they actually really value these emails. And I can tell you from personal experience, policymakers in the United States and maybe globally really care about the messages they get on Twitter and what they see in email. Like, they're as easily influenced as all of us when it comes to this sort of thing. They get the same kind of dopamine hits that we get. And so these two professors sent 15,000 emails to policymakers' offices that were drafted by ChatGPT-3, much older, more basic version of ChatGPT. And then they had students prepare 15,000 emails, which they also sent to policymakers' offices. And the response rate was essentially identical. So, suggesting very obviously that they weren't able to tell the difference. And if you've used ChatGPT, certainly if you use 4.0, you know that it's capable of creating very sophisticated email drafts. So that's really not a significant barrier for it. So that the outcome is not very surprising, but at the same time, it demonstrates the ways in which democratic systems are really vulnerable to technologies like these, because they haven't really changed very significantly, at least the communication channels, in a way that they've been secured. Similar issue, the FTC was proposing net neutrality laws in the United States a number of years ago, like 6 years ago, before generative AI was a really big thing. And the internet service providers band together, formed an industry association, paid an organization which paid a 19-year-old kid who then submitted 1 million fake comments to the FTC tied to this particular regulation, and was able to not only submit these fake comments, but steal identities of 1 million different people for each one of those comments. And it was such an incredible amount of comments that the FTC realized this was a problem and ultimately fined these internet service providers for having done this. But it was an early example of just how susceptible these sort of democratic channels are to advanced AI. So unlike WorldCoin, though, which is aspiring to create a form of digital identity that is decentralized in some ways, right? It's built, at least for now, on the Ethereum blockchain. The idea is that the information about your biometric data is stored and cryptographically secured on a variety of different servers globally, and that no one would ever be able to access it. So I'm not sure if that is all true, but that is certainly what they're aspiring to do. When it comes to government databases, they don't do that, of course. They're not that interested in decentralization. And some are starting to head in this direction because they talk about privacy, they talk about issues of security, about immutability, which are parts of decentralized blockchains. But generally speaking, the products that they produce don't really meet those aspirations. They end up really looking like variations on private databases that they've always had. So, a very scary example of the dangers of central identity authentication systems was one in Afghanistan. It's really a cautionary tale for this issue. So after invading Afghanistan, various foreign governments built out comprehensive stores of data about Afghans for various purposes. When the US military pulled out of Afghanistan very quickly, the Taliban gained access to some of these systems, which had information that included iris scans, fingerprints, photographs, occupations, home addresses, names of relatives. One such system, which was funded by the US government, had at least 2.5 million Afghans in the system, including a lot of their information, that the Taliban was able to then use to sort of target those who they perceived as opponents. So a pretty obvious example of the ways in which these things can go wrong. And you can think of, in various states globally, the ways that governments if they had this level of information about their citizens. And we were, as Professor Data was saying, government in Delhi suggesting that a lot of this issue relates to the safety of women, which is, of course, an incredibly important topic, but to what extent do they just want to perpetrate a system of surveillance that they previously didn't have access to and are now saying, well, AI requires that we do this, right? There's a lot of, as we were discussing a little bit earlier, AI washing happening right now in the world. And there's a lot of sort of fanciful ideas about what AI is, but something we'll talk about, I'm sure, later too. We got to think about the data that's being inputted, and we also got to think about what is fantasy and what is reality. Authoritarian governments, of course, are starting to rely more heavily on ID systems. And the most extreme example that we've seen is China, which is developing a social credit system that's aiming to monitor and maintain data on the lives of every Chinese person to build trust, so they say. Data there is gathered from a broad range of sources, but advances in technology like facial recognition software and AI have increased that data gathering capacity significantly. They also have installed 200 million surveillance cameras in China tied to this program. The credit system in China is still evolving, but the ambition is for each Chinese citizen to have a sort of number tied to them, and you'll receive lower social credit ranking for things like bad driving, smoking in non-smoking areas, posting fake news, frivolous purchases. They also include things, of course, like posting anti-government content or participating in illegal protests. And these social credit scores can then be used by government and non-government stakeholders to take actions against citizens that aren't acting in the right way under their rules. These can do things like, travel bans, school bans, reduced employment opportunities, public shaming, or to reward citizens in the alternative who have high social credit scores. So significantly here, the system uses AI to provide early warning of risky actors in need of extra regulatory attention, and has already led to 23 million people being blacklisted from certain plane and train travel. So when we think about systems like this, we think, oh, China's so far off, but from what we would experience maybe in the EU or North America, but many countries, even in the EU, have started implementing very comprehensive data systems for citizens. One that's particularly notable is Estonia, which is a private blockchain-based solution. So it's a blockchain solution, sort of in theory, but it's private in that it's really controlled by a very small number of people. When you think about a decentralized blockchain system, well, decentralization is on one end of the spectrum and centralization is on the other. And there's a lot of variables and features that can put a different kind of system on a different part of that axis. But as it relates to the system in Estonia, it's really government-controlled data sets that contain information on your biometric data, your fingerprint, potentially your eye scan, and then a lot of information about your employment, about your police records, et cetera. It has been used already, unfortunately, a few times improperly by the police service, by other agencies within Estonia. So it, in some ways, speaks to some of the convenience of big tech, right? We provide our information to big tech because it makes life very convenient. We get information, we get ads that are really relevant to our day-to-day. In the same way that the more information we provide to government, the easier generally a lot of service will be to access. Like you lose your clunky driver's license in favor of a digital license, so you never have to carry it anymore. And that's an upside. The downside might be that government now has biometric data on you. They might be tracking your phone more frequently than they already are. And as a result, they can start to build systems like this, right? And it really just takes the wrong government to come into power with access to a system like this to really demonstrate how horrible it can be. Now, decentralized identity systems, we think, offer a path that allows users to maintain some of that privacy while also having some level of trustworthiness. So far, decentralized ID that show most promise are built on decentralized blockchain. And there are many different types of decentralized ID already in development. South America has one called, in Argentina specifically, DD, which is a project aimed to improve trust and break down socioeconomic barriers. A lot of people talk about decentralized ID as it relates to things like access to bank accounts. There are many people who are undocumented globally who just have no chance of having access to bank accounts. This phenomenon even exists in the United States. And thoughts are that different programs like these could potentially help identify humans, tie them to certain membership groups like citizenship, and almost issue ID, even if from a private issuer, that can help them to make representations about who they are when they enter a space, particularly if they are undocumented. And Dr. Calzada mentioned another organization called Gitcoin, which is producing a pretty interesting decentralized ID called the Gitcoin Passport. And it's a cryptographic wallet through which you sign on to aggregate a number of different identifiers. So you could sign on through your Facebook, you could sign on through a number of different things that are tied to you, and then you're issued a score as to the likelihood that the person who is signing using this crypto wallet is in fact you. So that's all, a little complicated, but it's an important thing to consider, because the world we're headed towards is very much, unfortunately, this world where government just sort of accrues more data on its citizens. As we were talking about, as it relates to India, as it relates to Kenya, as it relates to really any country globally, this is the ambition of government, is to, at times maybe in a non-malicious way, make themselves more efficient. And through AI, through data collection, through the use of emerging technologies, they can become more efficient in some ways as it relates to using this technology. But there are obviously significantly negative implications for doing so. Emerging technology, not all bad news though. I just spent a lot of time talking about the stuff that could really go horribly wrong, but there are some bright spots. So there's currently a movement in various parts of the tech community to decentralize and distribute ownership of some of the technology that we're describing, and allow maybe normal people to have a bigger say in the ways in which technology is going to shape and influence their lives. This really aligns with what we're doing, and when we're thinking about a future where big tech isn't just kind of handing out pittances to keep us alive because they've taken all of our jobs, but instead where we are co-owners, co-creators, co-beneficiaries of these technologies, which are going to be such a significant part of our future. One of the ways that this is being experimented with is through DAOs, as I mentioned, decentralized autonomous organizations, that are a new breed of data cooperative-like structure that can take on a lot of different forms depending on the nature of the community's needs. They allow organizations to really operate from various locations, depending entirely on the need of the community and the organization. The idea behind them, and this isn't always, Dr. Calzada was saying, to what extent are these organizations decentralized? They aren't always decentralized. They might not really be decentralized at all. They could be enormous. Many of them have treasuries worth hundreds of millions of dollars. DAOs control the biggest decentralized crypto exchange called Uniswap, which has at times had like $1 billion treasury. But in effect, a lot of them are controlled by the biggest stakeholders who are able to vote based on the number of tokens they have. In practice, some of the biggest stakeholders have delegated their tokens to other particular users. So an interesting example is Andreessen Horowitz, which is probably the biggest venture capital firm in blockchain and one of the biggest in the United States, delegated their token voting rights in Uniswap and other platforms to student groups at Ivy League institutions in the United States. So my co-founder is actually the head of at governance of the Stanford blockchain club, and so they had kind of control over a really significant amount of the tokens that related to this ecosystem. And so this is an interesting experiment by A16Z, Andreessen Horowitz, in thinking about the ways in which they can maintain ownership while distributing control. And so DAOs are a pretty interesting form of experiment at the moment, I would say. But they're an experiment that has, at times, very high stakes. In many ways, what they do mirrors like that of a traditional co-op, where workers can hire their managers rather than the other way around. They want to be governed based on the contributions of the individuals who work for the DAOs, supposedly. And interestingly, with Uniswap, they were one of the earliest DAOs, would have had a major impact in the space. And if you were an early contributor to Uniswap, if you were participating in the decentralized protocol, either by being someone who provided some liquidity to the fund, or you just engaged with it, when they launched, issued you with a number of Uniswap tokens, which ended up being worth tens of thousands of dollars. So if you were someone in the global south engaging with this technology, you were in an interesting way, all of a sudden given access to a ton of capital that you probably wouldn't otherwise see by virtue of working in locally organized institutions. And it's a bit of an outlier, right? And it was also very early in a time when a lot of this stuff was very highly valued, and now it's a bit more distributed. But on the positive side, as we see more DAOs, we see more sophisticated forms of governance that enable people to co-own, co-participate in these kinds of organizational structures when they are not exclusively in the same jurisdiction. So when we think about pushing out of Silicon Valley, I think DAOs are a very interesting model to consider. They're also a model that's almost, that needs to experiment from a legal perspective, because there is no legal clarity as it relates to what DAOs are. Different DAOs have been subject to various enforcement actions. People sort of brand DAOs as a partnership. So in North America, at least, and in the UK, I imagine the same. There's a concept of a partnership where if you're working collectively with another number of other people and you haven't organized as a corporation, you're not provided with benefits around limited liability. So, those in particular DAOs who are collaborating sometimes have unlimited liability for something that their partner does. So at times, these organizations are potentially very dangerous from a personal liability perspective to participate in. They're very much on the cutting edge of both building technology, but also if you're an early entrepreneur in the DAO world, you're also at the cutting edge of sort of the development of the legal part of all of this. And it's something that our organization has the ambition of helping to solve, is providing legal clarity to those who are building in this space, because right now they're really very vulnerable unless they're very sophisticated and they know to sort of create structures that allow for them to be particularly protected. I would say generally, though, that there's more and more development in the global south than I've seen in a lot of other areas of emerging technology in this space. And that is maybe in part because of my personal experience, and I'll get into that in a minute, where when I left my law firm, I actually started working for an Argentinian company, because Argentina is very advanced as it relates to blockchain technology, and they're an economy that's dealt with a lot of issues in the last 20 years as it relates to their financial system and their innovation sector. So what's next, though? So more specifically, if we think about things like decentralization impacting what could otherwise be a very northern centralized technology, what comes after? So if DAOs, by way of particular example, could be something that could help empower workers globally to participate in organizations and be paid just as they would if they lived in North America. And there are hurdles, of course, tied to the legality of some of these issues, the scalability of some of these organizations. But those are questions that need to be answered before we can really make a lot of determinations about DAOs. So currently, most of the technologies I've described, of course, have largely benefited the global north, but we don't think it has to be that way. Taking steps towards creating equitably owned and governed organizations and systems really can have positive outcomes for decades to come, but we need to do so now at this point of transition. And so here's some of the ideas that I think people in our community are working on that I think are quite interesting. So one is Equity Lab. So Equity Lab is produces generative AI. It appreciates that generative AI processes are often opaque, and understanding which data has been used or whether it has been legally acquired is very hard to do. Tellingly, AI giants today have not compensated those whose data they have gathered, and creators of that data are more and more upset about it, as we're seeing in the press. Case in point, the New York Times is currently suing OpenAI for using their data without permission. Unfortunately, those of us in this room don't have the money of the New York Times, as far as I know. And so we can't sue OpenAI for using our blog posts or our papers. So we're really not in a position to do that. An alternative structure that some of these organizations are starting to think about is, to stop the New York Times from suing us, or just stop us from having a bad precedent in this case, maybe we get ahead of this and go to media companies and go to big players and start paying them, right? So we might end up in a situation where larger media companies do have significant access, larger media companies do have significant access to the revenue from OpenAI and other models, but the individuals who are producing papers who are producing blog posts will never have that same access. And it might look a little bit like the music industry in some ways, right? Where the smallest players who have their stuff put on Spotify now receive about $0.004, per stream. It's a completely unlivable way. You can't live off that wage, whereas Taylor Swift accrues significant value at the top. So we might see another version of that as it relates to the kind of models that are being built and the sort of business relationships that are going to be established in the AI world. Luckily, there are newly developing alternatives to centralized AI models, and Equity Lab is one. They hope that AI developers will use their software to create an immutable fingerprint of all of the model's components. So software essentially tracks different parts of an AI model as it's being developed. It turns that information into a cryptographic signature stored on a blockchain, which makes it theoretically impossible to tamper with. And what it would create ultimately is a transparent, ethical, and decentralized data system, which would be vital in any reforms aimed at digital justice. So it's both something that could track data for purposes of providing compensation to users and owners, but then also for purposes of a little bit more of a robust regulation of some of these technologies. And as I think maybe you or someone mentioned, a lot of the regulation that's coming out right now is really high level. Actually, I think it was someone in the audience dealing with some of the worst case scenarios, but AI is moving so fast as compared to that. There is so much regulation that we need to address in advance of just thinking about the biggest players in this space. And as someone who's worked in sort of blockchain policy for the last 7 years, I can tell you that there's a very low level of sophistication among the average policymakers as it relates to blockchain technology. And it's getting a lot more attention in the United States now because of the election and because there's a lot of money involved in that space. But it will take so many years for the most basic thing to get passed. And the pace of AI technology is such that it will be relatively irrelevant, by the time it gets passed. And those in Silicon Valley understand this. Like, they understand that part of this game is you need to innovate almost ahead of regulation, and regulation is quite slow. And you can also innovate ahead of regulation and enforcement. Because, for instance, if the Securities Exchange Commission or any other big regulator in the United States, the Department of Justice, comes after you, well, they might be caught up in litigation for 5 years. And then in 5 years' time, OpenAI is a critical tool that is being used globally, and there's no way the US government is going to stop it from doing its thing. I'm not, it's not just OpenAI, it's just sort of the nature of emerging technologies that if you are too big to fail, if you're a significant enough contributor to an economy, then the perspective on policymakers changes significantly about your technology. So it's actually in your best interest to innovate very quickly and move fast and break things. So public AI. This is another way to create AI systems, by the people, for the people, instead of being created, controlled, and monetized by tech companies. AI systems built by the public sector could ensure that AI was accountable to things like oversight communities, regulators, and voters, created by the community that is most affected by that AI, and could live within the scope of that community's values and priorities. One of their white papers states that states and public interest organizations don't have to be relegated to the role of rule maker. They can be inventors, builders, market shapers, and maintainers. This is very ambitious and exciting, but it's also, for those of us who work in government, it's like at times unbelievable, because right now, if you work in AI and you're kind of an industry leader, you can get paid a lot of money to work in private industry. And to go work in government on a tool like this, it's quite difficult to do. You really have to be someone who's intrinsically motivated to do so. So I am optimistic for organizations that do things like this, but I wouldn't rely too heavily on their success given government's track records in working with emerging technology. Another important consideration is data sovereignty. So policies such as data localization, robust data protection laws that can help safeguard data sovereignty and ensure that data is used for the benefit of local communities. This is very much a political issue, which means in theory, all of us can participate in working towards solutions that are helpful. I think Europe has obviously been a leader in data sovereignty and making demands of big tech companies as it relates to this issue. Making sure we're clear with political candidates that this is a priority issue for us is going to be really important on a go-forward basis, because it could be a significant impediment to sort of the pace that some of these companies run with. Capacity building is going to be really important too. I think someone mentioned, of course, as it relates to AI, you need a significant amount of capital, a significant amount of capacity, and we're seeing more and more countries really focus on building out, data server infrastructure, and that happens, those kinds of initiatives often happen at a federal level, particularly if you have a private sector that isn't very robust. And so the more that countries in the global south or just countries that are currently not players in big tech think about capacity building, the better off they'll be if they don't want to be relegated to a taker in this economy. So the unique potential of the global south, this will be kind of one of the things that I close out on. So gone through a lot of ways in which I think that the global south is going to face issues, but I do believe that there are some bright spots. And whenever there's a big transformation in emerging technology, there's an opportunity. This is the innovator's dilemma, right? The idea that new entrants aren't bound by their needs to generate revenue from whatever product they previously relied on. They are essentially free agents to be just unencumbered innovators. At the moment, the global north is definitely creating the most substantial amount of these technologies, and maybe the United States very specifically is doing this. There are exceptions, however. When I, as I mentioned earlier, started in this space, I was working for a venture capital firm based in Silicon Valley, but I quickly moved to an Argentinian company called Open Zeppelin. And I spent a little bit of time in Buenos Aires with that company. And Argentina has a long history of crisis and financial crisis in particular. They experienced hyperinflation of 20, 30, 40, 50% for the last 20 years. This year, I think their inflation rate was like 123% or 118%. So not too surprising that Argentinians were really early adopters of cryptocurrency. Argentinians have had a very hard time getting access to currency outside of their local currency for a long time. Government restricts the amount of US dollars that you can buy, and you have to buy those US dollars at an inflated rate. So there's a gray market for USD, and then there's like the official government rate. At times, government has gone into your US dollar bank account, converted into Argentinian pesos, which then depreciate in value 123%. You can see the problem here, right? They were very eager to move their money elsewhere. And so blockchain and Bitcoin at the time, as like the first large cryptocurrency, was a place they stored their money. And for many of us who use the euro or who use the dollar, it's, Bitcoin can be up and down 50% in a year, and that's a major change. But in Argentina, they're just always going down, right? And 50% is actually not really a major fluctuation for a country that experiences that on average for the last 20 years every year. So they were able to get in early. The same can be said of people in Venezuela, where they're having, obviously significant financial crises very frequently. One thing I noticed too among Argentinians is that they didn't just hold crypto as an investment. So most people in Europe or North America, they buy crypto on a centralized platform like a Coinbase. They keep it. They hope that it goes up in value. They don't know anything about it. And then they maybe sell it, and they speculate with it as they speculate with a stock. But people in Argentina hold that money personally. So they have a peer-to-peer wallet. They have what's known as a hardware or software wallet that they are controlling. They alone are controlling. There's no centralized database controlling that system. And in part, they are interested in doing that because government there has had such frequent control over their lives, has taken their money, has converted their money in the past. So they're really not interested in keeping it in centralized platforms that might have touch points with government. They would instead rather keep it in a way that is very much self-sovereign. So Argentinians are way ahead, and I imagine the same is true in Venezuela, and I imagine the same is true in various African countries too, in terms of actually understanding, on average, how this technology works. They're the ones who deal with the day-to-day. They're the ones engaging with the peer-to-peer side of it. They're not speculatively investing and sitting back. A lot of the biggest companies in this space are still, American or European, but you have more and more innovators in places like Argentina who are also set up very well for when the technology becomes mainstream to be, leading innovators in this space. And maybe a question you have is like, why are we talking about crypto when we're talking about AI? The two concepts are going to be pretty, there's going to be a lot of overlap between those concepts, both because they're two key emerging technologies that are being regulated right now, and the regulation of one will impact the regulation of the other. Another piece is appreciating that periods of transition like this allow for new entrants to make moves. It could be very difficult in AI, given that so much capital is required to build an LLM, but that could eventually change, right? And these periods of transition, of course, we might see some new entrants who otherwise weren't getting a lot of attention. Finally, blockchain as a potential mitigator of risk to AI. Decentralized identity systems are really going to be critical if we don't want to rely exclusively on centralized government-based systems that can really go poorly. So, conclusion. Intersection of technologies in the global south presents really significant challenges, but I think some opportunities as well. We've explored centralization and technological power in the hands of very few and the devastating effects it can have, particularly on vulnerable populations. But if we recognize this risk early and we appreciate that decentralization and maybe localization in many ways can be part of that path forward, we can start thinking about the solutions that are going to get us there. I think that we've also talked a little bit about ways in which Global South can be a leader in emerging technologies. But some key things to keep in mind is we need to be driving local solutions. We need to be driving concepts like data sovereignty if particularly these more vulnerable communities want to have any chance of ultimately competing or having any control over what Silicon Valley in the United States will probably have most of the control over. I think as individuals, right, it's going to be important to advocate for policies, for regulations that control these technologies in such a way that they prioritize equity, transparency, and local governance. These things are in many ways obvious, but it really hasn't been implemented in Web 2.0, Web 2.0. Big tech platforms are very thinly regulated in most jurisdictions, even in Europe, right? Europe does a much better job than the United States, but there's probably a reason why that is the case, because these are largely American companies. And so whether we think about our participation in this field being through advocacy or being through research or any number of different ways, it needs to be something that we focus on right now. And I'm happy that we're here today and that Ayuda and Acción and Dr. Quezada has organized this event because I think more needs to be done by folks like you to ensure that we don't just kind of wait and become takers, but we instead engage with this technology now so that we can mitigate its many risks, but also take advantages of the opportunities. So thank you.
So while the microphones are going to get ready, probably we need another one. Well, I don't know how you feel after these three, let's say, different, but I guess complementary presentations. So the schedule right now goes as follows. We have lunchtime is, if I'm not wrong, Ivan, at 1, right? So we have